Welcome to the March 2021 LPSB public meeting. As a reminder, please remain on mute unless you are speaking. A request would be that if you can, please be aware of your mute button. However, if you have a microphone that's on, then you may be muted during the course of the meeting. I'd like to welcome everybody, thank everyone for their continued dedication in the context of the pandemic. Although we see the finish line and more members of our community are becoming vaccinated, the numbers indicate that we are in a third wave, which requires our ongoing patience, our diligence, our caution, remembering that the lives of loved ones are very important and we're not out of this yet. With that stated, I'll call the meeting to order and ask for any disclosures of interest. All right, with none noted, introduction of addendum items and new business. I'd like to add a new business item related to the COAST program at the end of today's meeting. Can I get a motion for that? Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Mr. Lang. All in favor? Or just capturing Vice Chair Toth, if you could just give me your vote. Thank you. All right, carried. Moving along to the minutes of the February 18th public LPSB meeting, item 2. Can I get a motion that the minutes of the February 18th public LPSB meeting be approved as presented? Moved by Mr. Lang, seconded by Councillor Cassidy. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Item 3 is an update in relation to the public governance meeting, and I'll turn the floor over to Vice Chair Toth.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief update in terms of what we can discuss in public session. Obviously, we always go through the confidential legal matters and get updates on those. There was an update to a policy with respect to the Yippee student scholarship, a little bit of house cleaning there. And so that'll be put to the board for approval, and then it'll be posted online, so it'll be available for everybody. We were looking at promotional policy as well, but that's just needs a little bit more work. So at some point in time that will be approved and will also be available on the website for the public. There are 2 special investigation unit reports that will be made public today, and that was discussed at the governance committee meeting. And then there were some various memorandums of understanding that we had to sign, one pertaining to the coast agreement that I know we're going to be speaking to. And just a little side bit of news, we had 2 canine police service dogs who retired, and the ownership of those 2 dogs were transferred to their handlers. So they are going to be with their handlers forever and retire with those owners. So just a bit of an update there.
Thank you, Vice Chair Toth and Committee Chair. Are there any questions from board members in regards to the public update? All right, thank you. Moving on to item 4. This is public correspondence from the Provincial Special Investigations Unit. Unless there are any questions, can I get a motion that the board receives for informational purposes the 2020 SIU annual report as part of our public correspondence? Moved by Ms. Wellenreiter, seconded by Vice Chair Toth. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Moving along to item 5 on our agenda, this is the advisory panels. So we're happy to announce that we have made selections for members of our anti-racism advisory panel and our mental health and addictions advisory panel. We also have finalized members of the LPSB as well as members of the LPS that will be joining. Notice has been sent out to all those selected. We're all eager to begin their work, and we will be announcing more details shortly. For those who have applied, please be aware that we were extremely impressed by everyone's enthusiasm and amazing skill sets. It was very tough to have to whittle that down and balance the need for diversity across different groups. But if you didn't get formally selected, we hope that there will be tons of informal ways for you to continue to be engaged in this very important work. Do you have any questions from board members in regards to this update? All right, thank you. So item 6 is an audit of LPSB special funds. And I will turn it over to Deputy Chief Betts to see if you have any comments.
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually, if you're okay with this, I would like to pass this over to Director Kim Darling from Financial Services to provide the next 2 financial reports.
Go ahead, Director Darling. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So the special funds audit, the details required are included in a memorandum that came to the board. It's done annually. The board may remember that last year we actually, the savings account was closed and was combined with the TD account, and that ultimately will move over to a balance sheet account. So everything was in order with respect to those transactions.
Thank you. So maybe we'll see if there's any questions specific to this special funds account. And if not, can I get a motion that we receive the audits of LPSB special funds report and that we amend policy number 106 to reflect the revised account location? Moved by the mayor, seconded by Vice Chair Toth. Any questions? Okay, we'll call it the question, then all in favor? Carried. Thank you. Okay, item 7, the year-end position and reserve fund balances. Any further comments, Director Darling or Deputy Chief?
I'll just to point out that the year-end result, the dollar value may look high, but in terms of percentage, it's entirely reasonable. It's actually a really good result, especially given the challenges that we had with COVID last year. So I'm very pleased to to provide this report of the variances that we had and where we ended up.
Thank you. Questions from the board? All right. If there are none, may I get a motion that the board confirm the contribution of $1,558,563 to the unfunded liability reserve fund? Moved by Mr. Lang, seconded by Vice Chair Todd. A question, Councillor Helmer?
Not a question, just a comment. I want to say it takes a lot of discipline to get through a year like 2020 and come through with a small surplus. I think it's great leadership from the chief all throughout the organization to say we really need to tighten things up. It could have been a lot worse in terms of the impact on resources. I think the whole organization did a really good job of keeping things as tight as possible in a really difficult situation. And I don't know what the rest of 2021 is going to look like, but I think we're going to be in this kind of footing for a while, having to be very cautious about what's happening at a time when there's a lot of demands on the service, even beyond what's normally happening. I think it's really quite a good result from a financial perspective. And, there's a problem of having too big of a surplus, where you pull back so much and tighten things up so much that service really suffers, and I'm glad that we didn't have that. We don't have that situation where we pulled back too hard. We cut back on things that needed to happen. I think this is actually a good place to be landing in a very difficult year, and it's not going to happen every year, but I think it's quite good, and I wanted to comment on that. So thanks very much to the leadership and everybody in the organization who managed to get to this kind of result.
Thank you. Mayor Holder?
Thanks very much. I would echo Councillor Helmer's comments. My question, though, would be, as I look at all the reserve accounts, but in particular the unfunded, well, that total up and become the unfunded liability reserve, sitting at the end of December 31 with some $1 million. Practical question is there a point where we draw on that reserve or put it back into broader operating funds if there's some circumstance where it's appropriate or necessary? I'm just trying to get a feeling for perhaps that how big is too big, or what have we set a number or a goal where that is a reasonable number before we look at it another time for reasonableness?
Through the chair, I can provide an answer to that. We do have a calculation that we look at in terms of a minimum reserve requirement. It includes a swing plus or minus on our net operating budget, and also a provision in relation to unfunded liabilities, for example, accumulated overtime, accumulated court time, and awards time. So that is time that is in people's banks that there's no funding source for that necessarily. That calculation was derived with the input of the finance folks at the City of London. So I can tell you that the $10 million is slightly higher than that minimum, which is around $8 million. And I think given where we are with COVID, and given there are a number of challenges with respect to capital projects that have bubbled up that are urgent, it's prudent at the present time to not make any changes to that. It's something that is provided to the board annually. And so I think there's opportunity every year when that happens to have a look at it.
Mr. Lang?
Thank you, Chair. The reserve funds are something that will be on an ongoing basis reviewed quarterly by the Finance and Administration Committee. So we'll be looking at and updating the board on a quarterly basis with regards to the status of those reserves.
Thank you. Questions? We have a motion on the floor. Call the question. Is it written? When again, or
Sorry, David, we're having trouble hearing you. I think you asked who's in favor, all in favor of the vote, but
I'm not still needing votes here. So can you just get
it's not just me, right? It's
Okay. Yes. My apologies. Is my audio better now?
yes.
Can you hear me at this time?
You're back.
Is that better if I speak? Okay, thank you. Apologies for that. I was calling the motion to question. All in favor? Okay, carried. Thank you. Is my audio confirmed to be working at this time? Thank you. Moving along. This is the Organized Crime Section Adequacy Standards Report. Deputy Chief McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair, through you. This report is derived out of a board policy. It comes to you annually, and it's meant really just to be a really high look, high glance at what our joint force initiatives are with other services. The report is self-explanatory, just kind of lays those out in paragraph form for everyone just to kind of have a high level understanding of what it is we do and those partnerships. So my recommendation, pending any questions, is that the board receive the report.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. Any questions from board members? If not, can I get a motion to receive? Moved by Mr. Lang, seconded by Vice Chair Toth. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Item 9, this is the Internal Task Force Adequacy Standards Report. And again, back to you, Deputy Chief McIntyre.
Thank you, Chair, through you again. So this is very similar. Again, this comes to you as a result of board policy. This looks at the specific projects and or outcomes kind of from that on a case-by-case basis. It's not meant to be stat-oriented. It's just meant, again, to be that high-level look at different projects that have been running throughout the course of the year. My recommendation is that the board receive this report, and I'm open to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chief. Any questions on the Internal Task Force report? Councillor Helmer, followed by Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much for the report. I appreciate the detail about some of the projects specifically. One thing that really jumps out is the big difference between 2018 and the other 2 years. And I wonder if you just wanted to address what was going on in 2018 in terms of those projects, because just the scale of the number of charges and arrests is quite different. And you'll have to refresh my memory about if there was a particular project going on there that had a lot of charges, what the difference is between those years.
Thank you. Yeah, I can speak to that. So we definitely saw a real shift with the pandemic, and a lot of our response, the call volume dropped right off. A lot of the projects we would normally run were not applicable. And then they shifted. The focus shifted entirely to preventative efforts. And specifically one I can speak about that's received a ton of attention recently is all of the efforts and issues in the downtown core. So although those projects are running, the whole purpose of those is not to target marginalized people and lay various charges, it's prevention. And so we saw a lot of those. When we shifted our focus to really handle aspects of the pandemic that were unique in this time, it moved away from that high volume criminal code charges and warrant writing, et cetera, that you would see a normal standard functioning out of our CID side, and as well as UD, as we've just moved and shifted to COPE. So I believe right at a high level, without drilling in specifically, that's the bulk of that change that you're seeing. When you're looking at one, the number of projects really changed, and then the types of offenses coming out of those projects changed concurrently. So I hope that helps out kind of identify that gap.
Thank you, Mayor Holder.
Yeah, thanks very much. I noted a couple of the areas that you highlighted, Deputy Chief, were around stunt driving and loud vehicles. And I certainly from the mayor's office, I have heard a number of complaints. So the fact that you're addressing it directly and make reference here, I think is appropriate. One of the questions that would come to my mind is you reference loud vehicles and specifically car exhaust. Does that include within this report loud motorcycles as well? Because again, that's one of those areas that I have received probably more complaints than I thought I ever would on it. So just curious if you've got any reports around that.
Thank you, Chair, through you. So yes, it does include loud motorcycles. This was really complaint driven. And although our traffic unit works on these types of complaints all the time, we saw a notable increase in this, not only in that stunt driving or that speeding response, but we also saw that in aftermarket mufflers, exhaust systems on motor vehicles, but also on motorcycles. So because that became such an issue and really a concern for the citizens, it was disruptive. There was a special initiative that was run specifically targeting that. So you're right in saying that it included motorcycles in there.
Well, I appreciate that clarification. I think from a safety standpoint, I'm more taking the two, notwithstanding what I've heard through my office, relates to the stunt driving, which is the speeding, typically 2 cars racing or more in specific areas. It's interesting that you've been very specific and highlighted some of those areas. Noting that we have identified specific areas of concern, I presume that's less complaint driven than the police setting, being in that area to watch for that type of activity. Is that appropriate to say that?
Through you, Chair. I think I understood what you're saying there. You were cutting out a little bit, but I think I got most of it. We saw several specific locations being complaint driven. And so then we looked at, where are those complaints coming in? What is the data telling us in relation to that? And if we were then to do an initiative, where best to place ourselves to do the initiative, if that makes sense. So there were specific ones for racing that came right out of locations that they would meet and congregate prior to leaving a parking lot or issues like that. So we did see a lot of actual specific complaints at specific locations, which then in turn directed our officers to initiate a project at those spots. I hope I answered your question today, Mayor.
Sure did. Thank you, Deputy Chief. I've seen the movie Grease, and so we have, you see how these young kids often decide it's really clever to do this. How prevalent is that as a problem? I know there are complaints, but how prevalent would you imagine the problem relating to this stunt driving or car speeding, car racing is?
Through you, Chair. Sorry, I just about started to speak there to turn. When the pandemic was really at its prime, we saw the traffic on the roadways drop. That somehow created an environment for race, was really kind of encouraged racing. The roadways were open, they were able to speed with higher frequency. So we saw a bit of a correlation specifically to the pandemic. But I would say in general, when I look at the work being done out of our traffic management unit, you will constantly see, you'll see it in the media too, where they are towing vehicles as a result of racing. Racing is a kilometer amount over. So you're seeing that be a constant complaint of the community, speeding in general. That threshold that makes it racing, I believe, is 40 kilometers over the speed limit or 58 kilometers over the speed limit. And so do I think it was related specifically to the pandemic? No, I think that is a problem that we continually see and continually enforce.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
You're welcome. Any additional questions? Okay, can I get a motion to receive? Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Mayor Holder. All in favor? Okay, carried. Thank you. So apologies, my numbering was a bit mismatched with the agenda items. So we're actually now on agenda item 12, which is the 2020 Use of Force Statistics Report. And I will turn it over to Deputy Chief Betts.
Thank you, Chair, and through you to the rest of the board. I will say that this report is coming to you for your information, intended to provide for you an overview of the interventions requiring force used by members of the London Police Service during 2020. It also provides you with a 5-year comparison of the use of force statistics, including identifiable trends. I will say this report is lengthier than others, but I do feel it's important to take this opportunity to provide the board and everybody who is participating today with some information and education related to the use of force and the reporting of it. As I conclude this report, I will invite you to review Appendix B of the report. There's 11 pages which provide you with an unprecedented view of all the calls our officers have faced in 2020, which have resulted in an interaction that required a use of force report. I think you'll find it enlightening. So I'll start here on page 2 in the chart you have before you that outlines the number of use of force reports that have been submitted and the number in comparison to the number of calls for service and the arrests and mental health apprehensions as a result. The increase in use of force reports correlates to dramatic rises in the number of calls involving weapons in 2020, and I'll walk you through that shortly. But as you will see, we've had 274 use of force reports submitted this year. I will point out that a number of those, approximately 39 of those, are actually use of force reports related to the humane euthanization of animals who are suffering. So they're not all involving people, and that is broken down as well in Appendix B. The next chart on page 3 takes you through the types of offenses that are taking place that our officers are responding to in which an incident has resulted in the use of force. And I will point out that force and the application of force is driven by the situation that the officers are faced. It's driven by the actions of the person that the officers are interacting with and the sort of totality of the circumstances. As you'll see, of course, some of the higher numbers, I'll take you to the third last line is, and the row is weapons calls. Tremendous amount, as I talked to you about that correlation, 97 weapon calls. And that is again laid out for you in Appendix B. The next chart on page 4 is where we start to get interesting. Weapons carried by the subject. And we use the term subject here because that's the term that's used on the use of force form. And as a reminder from last year, that's a provincial form. It was never intended to be a research tool, more an information gathering tool that helps to drive training and continuous improvement in our organization. And as you will see here, the increase in the number of firearms that are involved. The number of incidents where subjects are armed with firearms rose significantly in 2020 over 2019. The total number of incidents involving subjects carrying firearms went from 39 in 2019 to 104 in 2020, a 167% increase, or 44% of our use of force reports. When combined with the 69 people carrying knives, that number rises to 173, or 74% of all use of force incidents, excluding, as I said, the euthanization of animals, in which the person faced by officers was in possession of or had immediate access to a weapon that may result in serious bodily harm or death. As you'll see in that use of force model in Appendix A, this precipitates the highest level of force available to an officer and is the absolute highest risk for everyone. In short, if a person is carrying or has immediate access to this level of deadly threat, they will most likely be met with an equal or greater level of force. And as we've talked before, it's amazing and a testament to the training our officers receive that serious injuries and even rarer deaths result. In 2020, there were no interactions with members of the public where a London Police Service member discharged their firearm. Again, tremendous testament to the training. I would also like to point out that the number of firearms involved in occurrences has increased year over year since 2016. And although this is a report about force responses by officer, I would ask you to reflect on the force that our officers are facing on a nearly daily basis. The unpredictable events that take place in an officer's life, few are prepared to deal with. And there's few more harrowing than facing an armed suspect. Few people would be willing to walk into such a situation knowing or suspecting that the people they're dealing with could end their life. It's been a challenging year for our officers, challenging with respect to the types of calls and the nature of the calls they're facing. And there is a direct correlation between the weapons that are being carried by people our officers encounter and our officers' response to keep themselves and the public safe. I'd like to highlight that no officers, again, discharged their firearms at or near a subject in 2020. So the types of force used is broken down on the page 5 and the chart in front of you. And I'll highlight that firearms pointed and handgun drawn are two of the higher numbers that you'll see on your form. And again, that is a direct recall, if you remember, to the number of firearms and edged weapons that our officers are facing. The reason for the force used, aside from what they're presented with, is on page 5 as well. And that's to protect themselves, to protect the public, to in effect arrest, to prevent commission of an offense, or prevent escape. Injuries. So the injuries of the 274 reports, or when we break it down to 234, when we remove the injury or the euthanization of animals, the number of injuries reported in 2020 were 36, and 8 resulted in injuries to officers. All injuries were listed and coded as minor in nature. Again, tremendous training. The majority of these injuries were as a result of a canine bite or medical personnel being utilized to remove probes from a CEW. Just for a reminder, CEW is what's commonly referred to as taser. Officer perception of race. So this is a new category, and as you'll recall from last year's report, this was added to the 2020 reporting. And in 2020, the Ministry of the Solicitor General added this, and it was added on the perceived race of the individuals that the officers were encountering when they were interacting with somebody in which force was used. Consistent with standards 40 of the data standards, the new use of force report includes the following question and the officer's perception of race categories. And you will note in Appendix C that I have listed to you the categories that are included in the data standards of the Anti-Racism Act, but I've also mapped them against the race categories required by the legislation that governs our interactions with people, commonly known as street checks, because they're slightly different. And that adds to a level of complexity when our officers are ascribing a perceived race. So the race is available to us on the use of force form are Black, East Southeast Asian, Indigenous, Latino, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and White. As we know, these are categories that are used as social descriptors in Ontario. They are provided to us. We did not come up with these. They're not based on science or biology, but on differences that society has created. They're known as socially constructed categories. For each report submitted, the reporting officer must include the perceived race of the subject that they were dealing with at the time the force was used. The overall number of subjects, as you will see on chart in page 7, exceeds the number of use of force reports. This is critically important to the interpretation of the numbers that are provided. Every single use of force incident is required to be recorded, and it is recorded as an incident, not based on the number of people involved. So again, when you refer to Appendix B, you will see a number of incidents where there were multiple people involved. This drives the numbers reported in the chart on page 7. If one incident, for example, an arrest of people in a home as a result of a search warrant, if there were 5 people in that home, 5 people are counted, but only one incident. If more than one officer has their firearm or a CEW or another use of force out at that time, they are each required to submit a use of force report, each requiring to count the number of people that were present. This again drives the numbers that go up. The only time that a team report is allowed to be put in is when the ERU is performing their roles and responsibilities or the public order unit. And as I said, a detailed list of all those occurrences that our officers responded to is in Appendix B. Included in Appendix B are the perceived race of each subject per occurrence and the details regarding how the officers came to be involved. The chart on page 7 provides for you a breakdown of the percentage of overall subjects that we were dealing with in terms of their racialized category. The number of incidents, as I said, are different than the number of subjects. Of course, you will notice some disproportionality between various racialized groupings, and that is something that I will speak to shortly in my trends and conclusions. So speaking of trends, the instances of forced use in 2020 were up significantly, as I said. However, as previously noted, this is largely attributed to the number of subjects in possession of or having immediate access to firearms. Although 2019 saw a significant decrease in the number of use of force reports, it's expected that absent the increased prevalence of firearms, 2020 stats would have been comparable to 2019. This year-over-year increase in the presence of firearms being present during police interactions is troubling, and it highlights the increasing risks our officers face daily. This is the first year that race-based data has been collected, and there is no benchmark against which to compare. There is no means by which to demonstrate whether the racialized categories and rates are proportionate to the number of interactions the police are having with each ethnocultural group represented and recorded. There simply isn't the data. As you will know from previous board presentations, in July of 2020, the CACP, along with Statistics Canada, announced a joint agreement to initiate a process to identify how and when such data will be collected involving police interactions. Once in place, not expected likely until 2022, a more comprehensive comparison of police interactions can be undertaken with greater data for several years. So in conclusion, the use of force training unit has identified there are no areas of concern arising from the application of the use of force as submitted in 2020. 70% of all our reported encounters, excluding animal complaints, were initiated by a source other than a member of the London Police Service. And this is important because the London Police are called when somebody wants help. And we're responding to 70% of those calls involving force is somebody calling the police for help. The percentage of ethnocultural community members involved in incidents in which force was used does appear to be disproportionate for Black and Indigenous communities. However, more data is required before a complete analysis can be made possible. This will require the collection of that data stemming from all police interactions in the city and will involve a volume of data upon which to draw more concrete conclusions. The data as presented to you here is relatively small, but it is a start. And as we know, small numbers lead to large differences in terms of percentages when you add one or two or a handful of changes in those numbers. Training unit members continue to monitor incidents of reported force and emerging trends in London and around the country to identify lessons and best practices to assist in the development of ongoing training. Our training unit emphasizes practical skills, de-escalation, and intervention techniques, and does not focus on the application of force. As you know, it's about intervention. You'll recall at the outset that I invited you to review the pages on Appendix B, where we've opened our records, provided you an unprecedented view of exactly the types of calls our officers are attending that result in force, or more appropriately, an officer intervention. And as you will see, the chart includes the occurrence, how the occurrence was initiated, the weapon carried by the person encountered by our officers, our officer response, and the number of people involved, including the perceived race of each of those subjects. As you'll also note in this report, consider the weapons carried or immediately accessible to the subjects, and consider that as far as this year goes, our officers have already seized a number of firearms, unprecedented amounts, many of which have resulted from traffic stops and other roadside investigations. And this is a concerning situation, and one we continue to train for and respond to appropriately. Subject to any questions, it's my recommendation that the board receive this report for their information.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Betts. I'm just going to start off and thank you for your report. I think that on behalf of the board, it's very important that we not fear data and transparency, but rather embrace it. And I appreciate the manner with which you've shared that with us. This data is important, and I appreciate the partnership that we have as a board with senior administration, moving us towards transparency and better use of data and statistics, such as those provided in your report. This information is important. This information helps us improve. And I also want to share with the public how much we've partnered with Deputy Chief Betts and Chief Williams on continuing to ensure that we have the data to inform the kind of necessary changes that we need. Also, on behalf of the board, to highlight that use of force remains to be an exceedingly rare occurrence in our jurisdiction. And I think that there's a high degree of professionalism that we must credit our frontline officers for in that regard. So with that stated, I would open it up to any questions or comments from members of the board. Mr. Lang.
Thank you, Chair. And through you to Deputy Chief Betts. A couple of observations and a question. You know, we're seeing use of force increase this year over last, in spite of the fact that we have 2,000 less calls for service in 2020, which in itself is disturbing. One of the things that I wouldn't mind some clarification on with regards to the information provided on page 4, the incident type, there seems to be a significant, it's very significant increase in robbery and domestic disturbance calls in 2020. And I'm wondering if this is COVID related with regards to some of the stresses put on society and obviously some of the financial pressures with being out of work and so forth. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that. And again, the other piece of information that I find very alarming, and I think it's important as a board that we recognize this as we go forward with supporting our administration with regards to forecasts and budgeting and allocation of resources, is the number of firearms that are being recorded as in events that the police are responding to. I find it absolutely horrendous that our officers are facing this type of increase. And so, Deputy Chief, if you could perhaps just clarify my first question with regards to the increase in robberies and domestic disturbances from an incident type.
Thank you, Chair, through you then to Mr. Lang. That has been a topic of some discussion, and I can tell you that Statistics Canada has been tracking this data since the beginning of the COVID pandemic to try and ascertain whether or not there is actually a correlation there. Certainly there has been much discussion, around whether or not domestic disturbances have been impacted and domestic violence, particularly intimate partner violence, have been impacted by the current COVID pandemic. And I suspect there'll be much study to be done. London Police Service is one of the participating agencies contributing data to Statistics Canada to help in facilitating their research and determining whether or not there is a linkage to that. To speak beyond that at this particular moment probably would be premature, but it's certainly observable, as you have indicated.
Thank you. Did you have any additional questions, Mr. Lang, before we go to Mayor Holder?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Mayor Holder?
Thank you, Chair. Deputy Chief, I spent some time on a call with big city mayors dealing with issues and trying to get a broader understanding of issues around mental health. And I note that in the occurrence type, you have indicated here mental health prevalent in a number of these calls. But my question is, when is, I see somewhere it says where the weapon carried by the subject is knife in hand, and I see that under a weapons call, but I also see it separately under a mental health call. How is that call made as to the occurrence type? Because firstly, I acknowledge that putting this information together and an extensive amount of work's been done, and this is helpful as a starting point. I think it's going to get stronger for us as we compare over periods of time. But how do I make sense of that so that I can so that I can try to determine, for example, why is it considered mental health versus a weapons call when they're obviously with a knife in hand?
Thank you, Chair, then, and through you to the Mayor. And great question. And really that depends mostly on how that information is received within our communications and our call center. So when this is what makes tracking the mental health calls so terribly difficult, because quite often a citizen will call us to an event complaining perhaps of a person armed with a knife or a person armed with a handgun. And we respond based on the call for service. What's the information provided to us? And that's how our officers respond. If there's no indication to the person who's calling and reporting it to the police that it's a mental health call, then we don't know that piece. And then I'm going to take this opportunity to circle back to that, is why it's so incredibly important, the work that the Coast team is going to be able to do to help us with addressing some of those issues upstream before it responds or it resolves in an incident involving force. In those cases, as you pointed out, Mr. Mayor, I mean, the mental health calls are people in crisis. And if we can get to them before they get to that crisis, then perhaps they won't appear on this chart. But what's really driving us is how a citizen is calling it in and how we're engaging with that particular individual. Sometimes it's an officer who's finding somebody who appears to be in mental distress or in a crisis. And that's when they discover that they might be armed during the course of that intervention. So those officer initiated ones, the vast majority are citizen generated, and it's how we're responding based on the information provided to us.
So through you, Chair, if I can, I understand that better now. You mentioned the Coast teams, and I think that's exceptionally important because we provide the right people on the call. But how do we make that determination? It's called a weapons call, knife in hand, but let's say it's just clearly it's absolutely a mental health issue. Let's just say, but you wouldn't, if you deem it a weapons call, you wouldn't necessarily bring out the appropriate professionals on that call with you. I presume it would just be police officers necessary to deal with that call. Assuming that that's the case, would you then, if in fact it becomes evident that it's a mental health call, try to then engage someone from the mental health community to come in and support the call?
Chair, through you and to the Mayor, and you've hit on the crux of the matter really, is that the police will never be totally out of this response, because when we do have a situation that clearly presents as a danger to somebody themselves or somebody else, particularly when they're armed with a weapon, the police will always have to be a primary responder. And I wouldn't suggest that we put anybody else in harm's way. However, once the incident can be de-escalated, then it would be safe to bring in a mental health support team to help to transition that person who's in crisis over to a different path. But we will be engaged, make no mistake. We can't deal with things upstream through models like Coast. These types of incidents will continue to be engaged. So there'll be some simultaneous research that will allow us, as you know, to look at what are our interventions and how are we having a downstream effect over the course of time.
Thanks for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just wanted to make some quick comments in a personal capacity and not as chair. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Vice Chair Todd. Thanks. So I just, in regards to the Mayor's question, wanted to make sure that I share that it's very important in the context of public discourse about violence and danger to highlight that individuals in our community who struggle with mental illness or with mental health are much more likely, vastly more likely to be victims of violence than to be perpetrators of violence. I think that the discourse on this topic often can become oversimplified. In no way am I suggesting that that was what the Mayor was saying. It's just to highlight for us as a board and for us as a community that when we see the information presented to us from Deputy Chief Betts, that we recognize not only that there's an intersection in terms of what's asked of policing, but we also recognize that how we frame issues related to dangerousness and violence does have a real impact and a human cost on the large numbers of our community, many of our loved ones, friends, and neighbors who do struggle with mental illness. So just wanted to share that personal perspective. Thanks. Vice Chair?
You want me to go next? Or give you back the chairship?
Yes.
I return the
no
chairship to you,
Thank
Chair,
you.
but I do
And
have a question. I'm not sure if anybody else was ahead of me.
Sure, so I'll catch that chair right back virtually, take a seat in it, and then give the floor back to you to speak, and then we can take additional comments.
Thank you so much, Chair. I have two sets of questions. The first is around a follow-up to what Mr. Lang brought up, which is again this dramatic increase in the weapons being carried and the types of weapons that are being carried. I'm just wondering, and I don't know if you know this answer on the top of your head, is this a particular increase in London? Are we seeing similar increases across the province? Or is this sort of, oh, we didn't expect this in London and it's a little more dramatic? And then sort of the second part to that is, as much as you're able to share, when you're gathering this data and putting it together, how does that inform how the police are responding to it? I'm assuming that something like this, does that make you shift? And I don't know how much you can share in terms of the intentions to shift to respond to this.
Thank you, Chair, and then through you to the Vice Chair. Great questions, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's important that we recognize this is not a London-specific problem or an issue. This is other areas across the province are facing similar increases, and it's equally troubling there as well. I'm sure when the mayor brought up his conversations with the big 12 city mayors, this is likely a concern across all the city mayors, and it is not a London unique issue. However, this is our home and it does affect us most personally. So it is personal for us, and that drives question number 2, and that is really how do we respond to this? So respond is really the word right now, is because we've identified a trend. We are working towards an informed response. I really won't go too much into those details at the moment. But when we do identify a trend, particularly a trend that's a threat to our community, we do make an informed and very specific response. We saw this in terms of some of our other initiatives in the downtown core with increased foot patrol and presence there. We can expect that there will be an informed, coordinated response to try and tackle this issue.
Vice Chair?
Thank you, Deputy Chief. That was that's very helpful. I think a lot of people are asking those questions. The second one is similar, but it's around the racialized data, and I think it's really important that this data is being collected right now. And I understand that we don't have any comparators at this stage, so we don't have a baseline, and it's going to take some time to build that. And I do appreciate that there's also some future plans to make that information more comprehensive. But obviously, from where we stand right now, I think some of those numbers are going to garner some attention. Certainly, it caught my attention. So when you see numbers like that, again, what kind of response are we looking at? Is this something we're still at monitoring stage? Is this something where we're thinking, okay, do we need to look at this more closely? I'm just wondering if we could get a little bit more details about that. And also, have we seen, I'm assuming other police services are collecting the same, but this is, I believe, was under, it's a new requirement. What are we seeing out of other community or comparable communities?
Thank you, and through you, Chair, to the Vice Chair. So thank you very much for that question. And it is, as you say, the numbers are as they are, and we are really influenced by small numbers, in relatively small numbers, and a change one or two numbers in each direction changes the percentages significantly. So to say that we're monitoring is absolutely accurate. Part of what I wanted to provide to you, as I have done in an unprecedented view, is the look of what we are responding to and how we're being called to those occurrences. You know, this isn't the police that are reaching out and randomly stopping people. We don't engage in those practices. We are being called for help, and we can't control to what the types of calls that we're being called for and who may be involved. Do we train? Absolutely. And do we continue to train, as you've heard, around conscious, unconscious bias and what our responses are like? Absolutely. And that will continue. I think that's important training. As you said, every other police service right now in 2020 is releasing similar data, and they're going through similar things. In that chart, you will see that there are multiple occurrences where multiple people are involved, and that absolutely will change the numbers of people that are being dealt with in any particular racialized grouping. So that has an impact. Small numbers, small change makes a big impact on the terms of the numbers, but it will continue to be monitored, of course. And then we continue to monitor it in relation to the types of calls that we're going to. And as part of our training unit is tasked with doing is how do we, if we identify issues or trends, how do we adjust our training and how we respond? So, but again, it all comes down to the start. And in that use of force model in Appendix A, that situation and circumstances is what drives our response. And in 70% of the time, what's driving our response is a call for help.
Vice Chair Toth.
Just very briefly, one final comment / question. I am really glad that we have this Appendix B. This is quite impressive putting that together, that level of detail. I've never seen that level of detail. So just a quick question. I don't believe, and maybe if you can confirm that this is something you have to do under we have to do the use of force reports. But this, I understand, is something that London Police have chosen to provide. And is that correct? Because I just think this is extraordinary, and I think very enlightening, useful, the transparency piece. But if it is just a London Police thing, I think we should make note of that too.
Chair, through you to the Vice Chair, as much as I would love to take credit for this particular initiative, I will say that I did get the idea from a neighboring police agency. When I saw that, I thought, my goodness, how come we haven't done this before? To your point, Vice Chair, it is not something that's required by the province. This is something that I believe truly transparent and progressive organizations are providing to the people that they serve in the community. So this I would expect to see in all future use of force reports because it provides that level of transparency that I think the community is craving.
Thank you. Additional questions or comments? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I wanted to echo the concern about the number of incidents where people are carrying weapons, especially when you see things like dramatic increases in the number of people carrying semi-automatic firearms. It's very concerning, and I think it's worth emphasizing that no firearms are discharged at people in an entire year. Now that's actually pretty common. Like it's a bit weird to say because I think it's so different from what people might expect if they didn't read things like use of force reports in London. And if you just watched TV shows and movies about policing, you think people were shooting guns every other day at people and having shootouts all the time. And I mean, I think there's been 1 year where I've been on the police board where there was a firearm discharged back in 2019. And otherwise, this is the more common report, which is there's been no firearms discharged at any people, and they're all related to animals when they are discharged. And I just want to emphasize that because these are very dangerous situations, as we can see from the descriptions in this report, and this doesn't even get into the dynamics of every individual situation. And although lots of force is being applied, when we look over the report, you can see that it's proportionate to the kind of risk that's involved, and the police officers are deploying the kind of force that's necessary to get people under control, and if they're trying to run away, to bring them back into control. And it's remarkable to me that we have these kind of outcomes consistently, especially considering the kinds of weapons and the number of weapons that are present. And I wanted to say thank you very much to the officers who are responding. I'm also glad to see when we see the injuries although there are some injuries to both the subjects who are being apprehended and to the officers, that even when there are injuries in these cases, they're relatively minor. And that's also not always going to be the case. That is a result, I think, of good training on the part of the officers, that they're, even when they have to use force, they're not using so much force that people are being injured very severely. And so I want to say that because I think that's really important to emphasize. I do have a question about the conducted energy weapons, because I see that the number of times that those are being used is going up. I think it is related, obviously, to the kinds of situations people are in. And when you look at the specific number of times where they're actually used and not just drawn, I just wanted to ask about that, how that is going, how officers are doing when they're in those situations. They have to deploy the conducted energy weapons. Certainly not as traumatic as deploying a firearm, but it's still a major event, and I wonder how it's going in terms of the conducted energy weapons. It's only been, I guess, I want to say 6 years or something that we've been carrying them on. So many officers have them. I just generally wanted to check in to see how that is going and whether there's any concerns or trends that you're seeing in terms of the use of the conducted energy weapons.
Chair, through you then to Councillor Helmer. So thank you, and thank you for those words. I absolutely appreciate that, and I know that the people, the men and women in the organization would as well. The question around the conducted energy weapons is really interesting, and if you'll recall last year, I took you through an explanation of how they work and the different types of methods in which they can be deployed. And it has been a tremendous, I won't say a game changer, but it is tremendous tool to have in our repertoire, something between, for example, the baton and the firearm that allows us to be able to de-escalate situations in the manner that's the least incapacitating over an extended period of time. So as we talked last year, the effects of the taser stop when the trigger is no longer being depressed. Right? So other than the probes that you might find, stuck to you, beyond that, the interaction stops. Most often, what we notice is that people are prepared to stop when they hear that sparking of the taser, and you hear that crackling noise, and you know that the next step from that is a deployment of that electrical probe. So that has a tremendous impact and influence on people. It has a laser sight, which helps us with our sightings to reduce injury. So that's also been an incredibly helpful addition to that particular tool. So, not sure if that fully answers your question, but I can tell you it's a helpful tool for us and a good opportunity to reduce the amount of potential injuries. It allows us to create time and space between us and the people we're dealing with, but it gives us an effective means by which to help to control if we need.
Thank you. Last thing I wanted to say is I agree with especially what Vice Chair Toth said in terms of the amount of detail. I think in some cases, detail can be overwhelming and it doesn't necessarily add a lot of understanding. But I think in this particular case, use of force is a complicated thing. I think after a few years now on the police board, I'm starting to understand some of these things. But I think for somebody who just walked into this report for the first time, if this is the first time they're reading about it, it gives you a good opportunity to understand, how does this work? What are the different kinds of ways that control can be applied? When is force going to be used? And I think the report itself is just very good at communicating what is going on. And Appendix B, although it's a bit overwhelming to read 11 pages of situations, it does let you get a sense of, okay, so here's the situation, if there's a firearm drawn and ERU is responding. And it also gives you a sense too how often a uniform division or ERU specifically is responding to these kind of complaints and how they're handling them. And yeah, I just think that level of detail is really helpful. Hopefully all police services are going to land at that kind of report, because I think it helps people understand what people are really dealing with out there.
Thank you. Any additional comments or questions? Can I get a motion to receive? Moved by Ms. Wellenreiter, seconded by Mr. Lang. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. All right, so we're winding down and into new business. There's a new business item to update the public in regards to the COAST program, and I will turn it over to Chief Williams.
Afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Deputy Chief Betts as well. It was a great report, and thanks for fielding all the questions as well. Just to circle back to the COAST model, I want to thank the board for the support for where the direction we're taking with the COAST co-response model with our community partners. I'm excited about it. So there's been a lot of work behind the scenes that I just want to acknowledge. So there are obviously some community partners. There's St. Joseph's Health Center, CMHA of Elgin Middlesex, and the Middlesex London Paramedics. So their leadership teams have worked with Superintendent Chandler over probably 3 or 4 months, working through the finer details of the MOU to bring it here today. A lot of work went into that. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I really want to acknowledge Superintendent Chandler, who's on the call today. He has done the lion's share of work behind what we're trying to do for a long time, well over a year probably. He's our mental health lead. And so I want to thank him for that. And Bill's actually going to be heading up our uniform division in a couple of weeks. So there's just a rotation of some officers. So we're really happy that he's going to be back in uniform. He has a ton of operational experience and really believes in what we're doing. He's got a passion for it, and his leadership is going to be so important because he will oversee the COAST team from the London Police side of things. So that's great. So thanks, Bill. And also Sergeant Mark McGugan, who I do not believe is on the call, but he, and you may or may not have met him. So he has a very strong operational background, an excellent communicator, but his skills are really in de-escalation, negotiation, and things like that, which is really key to what we're trying to do with this team. As was alluded to earlier, we don't want to be reactive. We don't want to get the 911 call. It's all about the upstream interventions. So, I'm excited about it, but if we can deploy those resources before the 911 call comes in, we know between the police data or police records and our partners' records who our clients are that cause a great deal of work in the community, and they cause, us to have to respond to calls for service. So if we can intervene with those folks earlier rather than later, then a lot of the calls we just spoke about, the use of force, the weapons, hopefully will be alleviated. So that's the direction we're going. So I just want to thank everybody, and those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. So on behalf of the board, I want to thank you. I want to thank the team. I did want to just personally thank Superintendent Chandler. Outside of my board role, I'm involved in our mental health community, and Superintendent Chandler is at every meeting, engaging with every organization, and he's just an exemplar for all of us. So thank you for your service and dedication, and we'll still recognize you in that uniform. A virtual round of applause, I guess, if we can give it. Any other comments or questions from anyone on the board? All right, thanks. So with that, I believe we're at the end. I'll take a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Vice Chair Toth. All in favor? Carried. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to community. Any media requests for the board, I'm happy to take in the next few minutes. Just contact us. Otherwise, we'll see you all in April. Thank you.